Hi. So today we're going to be talking about we're just going to start our discussion of critical reasoning. So this is kind of going to be an introduction to critical reasoning and sort of analyzing arguments to begin with. But by way of introducing this, we're going to be talking about the argument essay. Now, as we talk about the argument essay, just remember that this is all of the stuff that we're going to be saying is really relevant to other types of argument questions that you're going to see on the test. So let's get started. Okay, so after this video, you will be able to, number one, identify the elements that make up an argument. And this is a very, very important word that we see all the time. Number two, you'll be able to analyze critically an argument essay topic and just an argument in general. And number three, you're going to be able to effectively organize an argument essay response. And effectively, that also means efficiently, so doing it in sort of the least amount of time. All right, so let's move on. The big question, I guess, is really just what is an argument? And this is the word argument is really fundamental to a lot of what we're going to be talking about over the course of this course, really. So it's good to have a really firm foundation on the vocabulary that we're using really from the beginning. Okay, so what is an argument? Okay, well, let's take a look. In the real world, we certainly have a definition of argument. We use the word argument all the time, and we have no problem. We never ask ourselves what it means, right? We know what it means when we use it in the real world. An argument is some sort of dispute or disagreement between two people, right? People arguing over something means that they're kind of disputing something or disagreeing over something. Okay, be careful though, because that's not, it's linked to, but it's not really the academic world definition that we're going to be using over the course of this lecture series. Okay, so when we use the word argument in a sort of academic context, what we mean is the following. An argument is defined as any statement in which a piece of evidence leads to a claim. Right? So really the fundamental building blocks of an argument are those two things, evidence and claim. And any argument has to somehow include both of those elements. So evidence and claim. All right. Now, instead of giving strict definitions for all of these terms, I think it's good to just look at a few examples. So let's do that right now. There can be kind of humorous examples. Here are a few examples of arguments to get us inspired. Okay, here goes. So here's an example of an argument, really basic argument. It's raining outside, so remember to wear your coat. Right? This fits the definition of an academic argument. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about why in just a second. Another argument. I don't like my coat. It makes me look like a duck. Okay, that's another argument right there. Once again, this is kind of a real world argument. You might hear this in the real world. It'd be kind of funny if you did. But it fits the definition of the academic type argument that we were talking about a moment ago. Another one. Okay. I wear my coat every day and it makes me look like a guinea pig and you never see me complain, so just please wear your coat. Yet another argument, much more impassioned argument. There you go. Okay, so let's come back to the first argument that we listed. So it's raining outside, so remember to wear your coat. In this case, the evidence, right, the thing that the argument is based on, or the thing that the conclusion is based on, is right here. It's raining outside, right? That's the thing that's true. That's just a statement about the world, and it's leading to the opinion of the author, which is that this statement about the world, this evidence, the fact that it's raining outside, is why you should remember to wear your coat, right? So here in blue, I have the evidence, and in red, I have the conclusion. And whenever we talk about evidence, most of the time, the evidence is some sort of fact about the world, something that's just true. And when we talk about the conclusion, we're definitely always talking about some sort of opinion about that fact, right? But what separates a conclusion in the way we're using it from just a normal opinion is, well, in the real world, of course, you can have an opinion about anything. You can believe anything you want to believe. There's no rule about that. But in when we mean conclusion, it needs to be an opinion that's really based on something that's logical. Okay, let's look at the second one. I don't like my coat. It makes me look like a duck. Okay, well, in this case, it's kind of the order is reversed because the evidence here, the reasoning, is back here. This is the evidence. It makes me look like a duck, and that's the reason that I don't like my coat, right? So we don't always have arguments that are just in that direct order, evidence and then conclusion. We can also have them kind of in the reverse order, like we have here. Okay, well, let's look at the last one. I wear my coat every day and it makes me look like a guinea pig, and you never see me complain, so just please wear your coat. Okay, here there's a lot of evidence that the person is offering up, just trying to get this person to wear the coat. All of this is evidence that's being presented. It's just, look, I wear my coat every day. It makes me look really stupid. I never complain about it. So therefore, based on all of this evidence that I've just presented to you, just please wear your coat. Right? That's the conclusion. Okay, so hopefully you have kind of a sense of what evidence means when we talk about it here, and what conclusion means when we talk about it here. Just remember that evidence is kind of the thing that's leading to the opinion, and the conclusion is the opinion itself. Okay, let's move on. So the first step, whenever you see an argument, and this is not just in the argument essay, this is any type of question that deals with an argument. Anytime you see an argument, you should automatically say to yourself, what is the evidence and what is the conclusion? Okay. So anywhere you see an argument, you should immediately be seeking to identify the evidence and the conclusion in very precise and clear terms. We're going to take a look at a few examples right now. So here is an argument, and what I'd like you to do is read it, right, and then write down the evidence and the conclusion of the argument. And I specifically, and this is important, I want you to do this in your own words, because after all, on the argument essay, you're going to have to, write these things clearly in your own words. So try to write them in full sentences, but using your own words, not just rewriting the words that are in the text. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that. Here goes. Okay, so time is up. All right, so let's we're gonna look at one way of writing down the evidence and the conclusion. We're gonna look at them together. But first, I just want to let's just reread the essay topic together. This is a real essay topic, by the way. Okay, so I'll begin at the beginning. The following appeared as part of a campaign to sell advertising time on a local radio station to local businesses. And then here's the real argument. The Kumquat Cafe began advertising on our local radio station this year and was delighted to see its business increase by 10% over last year's totals. Their success shows you how you can use radio advertising to make your business more profitable. Okay, so let's take a look at the conclusion first and then the evidence after. So I wrote down something for the conclusion. This is what I've got. So the conclusion here, the opinion of the author really comes at the end. You can use radio advertising to make your business more profitable. And I admit I could have written it a little bit more in my own words there, but what can I say? I didn't. But really, if the author was to kind of get rid of everything else, if you basically said to the author, look, we can't include all these words in this text, just get straight to the point, this is probably what the author would leave, right? This is what the author would say. This is the author's main conclusion here. Okay, what about the evidence? Well, this is what I've got for the evidence. So the evidence. After the Kumquat Cafe began advertising on the local radio station, its business went up by 10% over last year's business. Okay, so yeah, I did maybe a little bit better of a job doing that one in my own words. But there you go. So really, it's kind of the first sentence that is the evidence. Now be careful with this, because what you might have written, what many of my students sometimes end up writing is something like, the Kumquat Cafe's business went up by 10% because of the radio advertising. And that's certainly something that's implied in the text. But be very careful about those sorts of things, because that's not actually directly stated in the text. And so we want to be very careful when we're just identifying the evidence and the conclusion. Make sure that you're not adding anything extra to the text that's not already there. Okay, so there you go. We're going to do this again. Another text, another argument, and same question. I'd like you to write down the evidence and the conclusion of this argument in your own words. And once again, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this. So here goes. right, so time is up. So hopefully you had a chance to read everything. There's actually a lot more here and to write everything down, and indeed there's a lot more to write down. If not, you can always, of course, pause the video and take a moment to do that. Okay, well let's go through this together. So first I'll just reread the argument, and then we can look at what I've written. So it says the following appeared as a part of an advertisement for Adams, who is seeking re-election as governor. Okay, re-elect Adams and you will be voting for proven leadership in improving the state's economy. Over the past year alone, 70% of the state's workers have had increases in their wages. 5,000 new jobs have been created and 6 corporations have located their headquarters here. Most of the respondents in a recent poll said they believe that the economy is likely to continue to improve if Adams is reelected. Adams's opponent, Zebulon, would lead our state in the wrong direction because Zebulon disagrees with many of Adams's economic policies. Okay, there's a lot more going on in this text, but we can certainly, hopefully, all agree on what the conclusion is. What's the kind of the main opinion of the author? The author has a lot of opinions here, or a couple opinions here, but he certainly has one that's really, really big and prominent. I'd say basically it's this: re-elect Adams if you want good economic leadership, right? Really, it's that first sentence of the argument that is the conclusion. So he really wants you to re-elect Adams, but specifically for economic reasons, right? Not necessarily for other reasons that you might have for re-electing or not electing Adams, but for economic reasons you should elect Adams, right? Okay, what's the evidence that this author presents? Well, there's a lot. I've written down pretty much all of it, trying to keep it in my own words, of course. So last year, most wages increased, many jobs were created, and a few corporations moved their headquarters to Adams' state. Additionally, a recent poll showed that many people really believe Adams will help the economy improve, and then finally, Zebulon would be bad for the economy. Right? All of these things are pieces of evidence that the author is using to basically to get you to agree with him that you should re-elect Adams if you want this good economic leadership to continue. Okay, so that's all pretty good. Hopefully that's been clear. Any argument, whether it's simple argument or a complex argument, you can always identify what the evidence is and what the conclusion is, and it should become almost like a reflex to you to sort of be reading something and suddenly you say, oh, that's an argument. Oh, this is the evidence. Oh, this is the conclusion. You just kind of take a moment to situate the argument in your brain, and then you move on. Okay, so let's get on to the next part of this. So the second step, whenever you see an argument, is the following. You want to basically say to yourself, what questions would you have for the person that is making this argument, right? If somebody were to present either of these arguments to you, just in a normal, maybe business context or just in your everyday life, what questions would you have for that person? Very simple. Okay, we're going to dive back into the same arguments. So you've already read this argument, you've already identified the evidence and the conclusion, and now what I want you to do is take a moment to write down 3 precise questions that you would have for the person that's making this argument to you, right? Our point here is not to decide whether this is a good argument or a bad argument, right? That's not our job. Our job is just to think about what sorts of questions, good questions, would be relevant for this argument. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that right now. Okay, so time is up. And once again, if you haven't had time to finish what you're writing, you can always pause and take that time. Okay, so 3 precise questions that you would have for the person making this argument. I'll give you sort of the questions that I had. Now, of course, there are many questions that you could ask here. You can get very, very creative. What we want to just make sure of is that we're finding, some of the important questions, and that we're also finding questions that are relevant. Right? So it's important to just find each of those things, and to really make sure that when you write down a question, you sort of say to yourself, okay, wait a second, is this really relevant? Would this actually be helpful? Because oftentimes we think of something and it really feels relevant, but then we realize actually that wouldn't really help us very much. So, for example, you might have been tempted to say, well, okay, the business increased by 10%. But, does 10%, does that really represent a very big number? Is that only like $100 over last year? I mean, if, depending on how much revenue this cafe is bringing in, hopefully 10% of their total revenue is more than 10%, sorry, is more than $100. But, that's possible. In any case, it doesn't actually matter in this argument if that's like a big number or a relatively small number, right? That doesn't actually matter. What matters is that it increased. That's what the author would probably say. Oops, give me 1 second. Okay, that's what the author would probably say. What matters is, did it increase? Okay, so let's take a look at this right now. So here's what I've got. So did the cafe do anything else to advertise other than the radio, such as TV commercials, for example? Right? So in other words, okay, we know that, yes, they advertised on the local radio station last year, and we also know that their business increased by 10%, right? But we don't actually know whether that 10% is specifically due to the local radio advertising, right? Maybe they also advertised on TV, and that's what brought the people in. We don't know, right? So this would be a very relevant question to ask whoever's giving us this argument. Another one. Did the cafe's expenses increase during this period, right, to such an extent that the greater revenue caused by the advertising was offset by the greater expenses? Okay, maybe I could have been a little bit more concise in the wording of that question. But basically, if you look at the conclusion, the author is saying, that the radio advertising can make your business more profitable, right? And of course, profit, that's just what's left over after you subtract your expenses. Now, if the expenses go up, even if the total revenue goes up as well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the profit has increased, right? There's a difference between business increasing or revenue increasing and profit increasing. So that's certainly something that I'd want to know. I've got another question. Would this type of local radio advertising truly work for any business, even, for example, like an online business whose clients are not local, right? Remember, the conclusion of this argument is that, because it worked for this cafe, you can use radio advertising to make your business more profitable, right? That seems to be directed at all local businesses, right? But a local business might have a client base that's not local, right? So a local radio station really wouldn't help that type of business, or probably wouldn't help that type of business increase their clientele. Okay, so that's what I did for this argument. Why don't we look at the next one? So once again, I'll give you the argument. Same question. I'd just like you to think about a bunch of, just to brainstorm and just to write down 3 good questions that you would have for the person making this argument. One thing that I guess I forgot to mention a second ago is that each of the questions that I presented was really precise. I tried to make those questions as precise as possible by giving really precise examples, right? So I didn't just say, well, maybe it wasn't due to radio advertising. I said maybe it was due to something else like TV commercials, right? That gave a really precise example. So I'd like you to do the same as you're trying to formulate your questions, because that's going to really be helpful later on by giving not just the problem but also a precise example. It's really going to help us out a little bit later. Okay, so once again, I'll give you 2 minutes to do this. All right, so time is up. So once again, I'll give you a couple questions that I came up with, and you can sort of compare. So I tried to be precise. Let's see if I was. So here's one question I have. Well, was Adams the one responsible for all of these economic examples, or are they merely sort of national trends, right? So, for example, he says that 70% of the state's workers have had increases in their wages. Well, okay, that's a good thing. That seems like a good thing, certainly. But that doesn't actually tell us whether it's Adams that caused that to happen. Maybe this is just sort of the national economy is doing well, including the economy of the state with Adams as its governor. So maybe they're just national trends. Maybe it's not Adams who caused this to happen at all. Another question I have, kind of look at that poll and say, was that poll truly representative of the population as a whole, or of economists, or was it simply a poll among supporters of Adams? Right? I guess it would be a little bit more convincing if it were of the population as a whole, or I guess if it were a poll about sort of among a group of experienced economists who really know what they're talking about. But of course, if you learn that the poll was just among people who like Adams, well, the fact that they said that the economy is likely to continue improving is not really a very convincing piece of evidence here. What other question would I have? Well, yeah, so will the new corporations provide a stimulus to the local economy? Or will their true economic benefits only be felt in other places, right? So here, if we look back at the text, the author says that 6 corporations have located their headquarters here, which sounds good when you present it like that. But let's just remember that locating headquarters to this state is very different from really bringing jobs to the state, or boosting the economy, or dealing with local suppliers or local businesses. It's very different from having a strong economic benefit on the local level. right? So that's another question I would have. Now, of course, there are many more questions than this. I mean, we could have also talked about, right at the end when the author mentioned Zebulon, we could have talked more about those new jobs. We could talk more about the workers' wages, and if you had talked about those, that's absolutely fine as long as all of the questions that you have are relevant to the argument. Right. Now, when we're thinking of these questions, it's important, of course, to remain relevant, but it's also important to kind of find the most important questions as well. Like anytime I see a poll, I'm certainly going to think, okay, I want to know if this poll is if the methodology behind this poll is really good, right? Is it representative? If I see something also that's talking about what happened over the last year and saying that's kind of implying that it's caused by a person, I'm gonna say, well, is there any other explanation for why this happened, right? Is that the only possible cause? So those are certainly very important questions that I'd really want to think about anytime I read this argument. Okay, great. Well, we're moving along quite smoothly. Let's get to the next topic. Oh, actually, no, before we get to the next topic, I just want to actually define more clearly the topics that we've been dealing with a moment ago. So what is a weakener? In fact, we've been using the word, or we've been using the concept of a weakener already. Each of those questions that we just asked, that we just formulated, was a weakener. Right? We presented a sort of weakness in the argument by asking those questions. When we said, you know, is Adams really the one who caused these things to happen, or were they just a national trend? Right? We put forward a potential weakness in the argument, and that's what a weakener is. And I'd like to get a little bit more precise in terms of vocabulary. So let's try to do this. So what is a weakener? A weakener is really quite straightforward. It's a specific situation, and remember, it has to be precise. We talked about that earlier. It's best if it's precise, at least. So a weakener is a specific situation that could be true given the evidence, and this is something we haven't really mentioned, but each of those weakening sort of questions that we asked of the person was specifically related to some piece of evidence that the person had given, right? That could be true given the evidence, but that would lead to a different conclusion, right? So that's sort of the more formal definition of what we mean when we say weakener in an argument. Now, I want it to be really, really clear in your minds. It's really important to remember what we just said a moment ago, that a weakener must always be based on the evidence, right? It has to have some reference to the evidence. If it's just kind of asking about the conclusion, about the author's opinion, that's not a legitimate weakener. Right? So usually to find weakeners in arguments, it's good to kind of look at the evidence and really pick apart the evidence itself. In some ways, when you're weakening an argument, the evidence is more important than the conclusion. That's a point that's going to become way more important when we deal with other types of questions as well. Another quick point is that it's got to present a specific situation. I said this before, but I'm going to say it again because it's really important. It's got to be precise and specific. It can't just be a general statement or sort of an open-ended question like, well, did Adams cause these things to happen? No, it has to present an alternative possibility, right? So it can't just be a general statement. It's got to present an alternative possibility. And this alternative situation, this is what we define as a counterexample. So a counterexample is kind of part of what a weakener is. They're not quite the same thing. Let's just be clear. But counterexamples are really important when you're formulating your weaknesses for the essay. You have to present those specific alternative possibilities. Just asking a kind of open-ended question is not enough. Okay, cool. So I want to move on now to another essay topic. And this time I want you to find those sort of weakening questions on your own. So first of all, obviously you have to identify the conclusion and the evidence, right? And then after you do that, I want you to take the time to write down 3 precise weakeners with precise counter examples. And when you write down a weakener, sometimes it's helpful. I certainly find it helpful to maybe start with the words "what if," right? But basically, any question that's precise that would be directed at this person is a sufficient weakener, uh, as long as you have a precise counterexample as well. Okay, so I'll give you a few more minutes this time to do this, and here you go. Right, so time is up, and so once again, if you didn't have time to finish writing down and analyzing all of that, um, that's not a problem. Just pause the video and finish up, and then come back afterward. And don't worry about not having been able to do it in the amount of time I just gave you. That's something that will come with practice. That's what practice is for. Okay, so let's do this together. So first of all, we wanted to identify the evidence and the conclusion, right? Well, let's do that. So this is what I've got. The conclusion is it's actually kind of a little bit harder to find here. It's the second sentence. It's basically the author is making a prediction saying that the restaurant industry in Spiessa will continue to grow. Okay, so if we read through this, it's the first sentence is, over the past decade, the restaurant industry in the country of Spiessa has experienced unprecedented growth. This surge can be expected to continue in the coming years. Right? So the author is really making, that's kind of an opinion about the future, or a prediction that the restaurant industry is going to continue growing. Okay, so hopefully you got that. Now the evidence, why is it going to continue growing? What's the basis for this? What is the author saying as evidence for this? Well, it's really all those social changes. So the evidence is that personal incomes are increasing, people more free time, there are more people who are single, and people are more interested in gourmet food, right? Those are each of the pieces of evidence that the author gives about his opinion that the restaurant industry will continue to grow. Okay, so hopefully you've got something close to that, maybe in different words. That's absolutely fine, no problem, right? But hopefully you got something like that. Okay, well, let's look at weakeners. Now here I've just made the text smaller, so don't worry, it's the same exact text as before, just so that we have it still on the screen. I just made it kind of a little bit more condensed. Okay, so you could have come up with many things. There are many things that we could say here. I'm not sure that one is more important necessarily than any of the others, but I'll just give you a couple that I thought of. So one that I thought of is, that I definitely want to ask this person, is, what if something like an economic downturn suddenly causes many of these social changes to reverse in the near future, right? I mean, a big thing is that basically the author is saying the economy is doing well, like personal incomes are going up, and people have more leisure time. Well, what if there's a big economic disaster and suddenly people aren't making as much money as they were before, and people have to work more because they're not making as much money? Wouldn't that hurt the restaurant industry, and not cause it to continue increasing? That's certainly a question that I would ask. Next question. Yeah, well, what if restaurants in Spiessa don't generally serve gourmet food? What if they are fast food restaurants or something like that? Yeah, so if they don't serve gourmet food, the people who are interested in gourmet food are obviously not going to be very interested in these restaurants, right? And so that would not be a very good piece of evidence for this argument if the restaurants themselves aren't serving gourmet food. Another one. Yeah, this is maybe, well, I hope maybe you would have found this one. This is certainly an important one, I guess. What if the cost of living in Spiessa is rising faster than personal incomes? Okay, because after all, the author says that personal incomes are rising, therefore, the restaurant industry is going to continue growing. But if the cost of living, so like rent and taxes and consumer prices, things like that, are rising even faster than those personal incomes, people won't really have much more purchasing power to go to restaurants in the country. And we could also say the same thing about, what if restaurant prices are rising faster than personal incomes? I mean, if that's true, then people don't have much more ability to go to restaurants than they did before. So they got another here. So what if single people generally prefer to cook for themselves at home rather than going to restaurants? Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was single, I certainly wasn't going to restaurants all the time. Certainly not as much as I do now. So I think that that's quite a reasonable question here. We don't know if maybe single people in SPS are different, or I'm not representative. My own previous experiences are not representative of people in general. I don't know, but it's certainly a question that I would have. Uh, don't single people generally prefer to just not go to restaurants alone? Maybe they mean that maybe the implication that the author is giving is that single people go on dates or something like that, and that brings them to restaurants. But don't people in couples go to restaurants as well with their wives and children? I don't know. In my experience, I think that they do. Okay, so hopefully, you may have had some of these same questions. You may have had completely different questions. That's all fine as long as you can really justify them, as long as they are fully relevant to the text. Okay, let's go on to the next big thing. The final step. So we've already gotten pretty far here. It may not feel like we've done very much, in fact, but we have. You'd surprise yourself. So the final step in analyzing an argument is the following. It's to find the underlying assumptions. And this is sometimes the more difficult step. At least, a lot of students that I've worked with have had the most difficulty with the assumptions, and it's kind of one of those scare words. I call them scare words because people read them and they think, oh geez, this is going to be complicated assumption. I don't like that term. There's no reason to be scared of it, especially not after we look at what they are and how to find them. So first of all, the strict definition of an assumption. An assumption is it's got a couple components. Number one, it's something that's not directly stated by the author. So anything that is directly said in the text is by definition just not an assumption. So it's not in the text itself. Really important. Number two, it's a necessary condition for the argument to be valid. Basically, it's something that has to be true, right? It's just something that has to be true if this argument is going to work. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's going to make the argument absolutely correct. Right? The argument could still be wrong even if the assumption is true. Right? We'll get to that in future lectures. It's probably not necessary to go too deeply into that right now. Okay, to find an assumption, however, using these two sort of strict definitions, it's a little bit hard. It's a little bit abstract, this concept of an assumption. And that's I think why people are so scared of the word, or at least my students often tend to be. But really, there's an easier way of looking at it. This definition we've just mentioned is really important to know and to remember and to come back to all the time. But there's an easier way of thinking about what an assumption is. And here it is, and this is what we're going to be using for this essay. The easier definition is simply an assumption is just the denial or opposite of a weakener. Right? Okay, so one way of looking at this is basically that the author who's making this argument clearly believes that his argument is correct. Right? Any argument that is being made, the person who makes it believes it's correct. Right? The person believes, in that previous argument, the person believes that the restaurant industry is going to grow. And if you think about it, if that person believes that the restaurant industry is going to grow, that person must also believe that all those weaknesses those potential weaknesses, those possible weaknesses that we brainstormed a moment ago, the person must believe that those are not true. Because if the person also believed that they were true, then this argument would make no sense. Right? That's what we are kind of getting at with this easier definition of an assumption. Now, I know I said it's easier. I didn't say it's easy. It's still a little bit confusing until you start seeing examples and really working with it in a practical sense. So that's what we're going to look at in the next slide. So here are a few examples of what we mean by assumptions. And in fact, we're going to take the same weakeners that we just saw a moment ago. So this was our first weakener in that previous argument. What if an economic downturn causes many of these social changes to reverse in the near future? What if they just stop happening, right? Because the economy goes down. Okay, well, really simply put, the assumption about that we could base on this weakener, an assumption that the argument is making, is an economic downturn in the near future will not cause many of these social changes to reverse, right? Or something like that, there will not be an economic downturn in the near future, right? If the author is making that argument, the author is, believes the argument that he or she has just made, and so this author really must think that an economic downturn in the near future is not going to suddenly destroy everything, right? Or that an economic downturn is just not going to happen, right? So that's an assumption that the author is making. It's something that the author hasn't told us directly, but it has to be true. It has to be true if this argument is going to stand up. Okay. Now, how did I find this assumption more practically speaking? Well, it was actually pretty easy. I just took that weakener, I rewrote it, and instead of, the verb in the positive, I put the verb in the negative. That's literally all I did, right? So instead of, an economic downturn in the future could reverse some of these changes, I just said that's not going to happen, right? So that's the assumption that the author is making. Let's see another example. So the next weakener was, what if restaurants in Spiessa don't generally serve gourmet food? Well, this is a pretty easy one. The assumption based on this is that at least some restaurants in Spiessa serve gourmet food. Probably it would maybe even be better to say most restaurants serve gourmet food, because the author is using this as evidence, right? So that's an assumption, something that the author hasn't told us. He hasn't actually told us what type of food the restaurants serve, but he does say that people are more interested in gourmet food, so it better be true that they serve gourmet food if this argument is going to work. Okay, next weakener. We said, what if the cost of living in Spiessa is rising faster than personal incomes? Well, once again, we can just deny that statement, and we get an assumption. The cost of living in Spiessa is not rising faster than personal incomes. And I admit I've made a horrible spelling mistake in this assumption. I hope you do. Excuse me, it should be than, not then. But so I at least I've admitted it to you guys right now. Okay. The final one. So the final weakener was, what if single people generally prefer to cook for themselves at home rather than going to restaurants? Okay, well, to find the assumption, it would basically be the following. Single people generally prefer to go to restaurants than to cook at home. Really quite straightforward. So in each of these cases, I've just denied the weakness, right? I've just said that weakness, actually that's not going to happen, and I found the assumption. And you can really think of assumptions as assumptions are in arguments already. We just need to find them. They're not things that we've suddenly created ourselves. They're actually, they already exist when we read the argument. And when we read the argument, we implicitly sort of see or feel some of these assumptions. And so much of what being good at critical thinking is about is identifying those assumptions clearly to yourself rather than just letting them kind of influence your thinking in a kind of unconscious or subconscious way. So the assumptions are things that the author is already has kind of somehow put in the text without directly putting them in the text. They're between the lines, as it were. But we can find them by looking at those weakeners. Those weakeners that we've created ourselves, in fact, can allow us to find the assumptions that already exist in the text. Isn't that kind of loopy? But I think that's a good way of looking at it. And hopefully as you get more practice, you'll see more clearly what I mean. Okay, so let's just review where we are so far. Number one, step one is you got to identify the evidence and the conclusion of the argument. Really quite simple. Step two is you want to think of 3 or 4 weakeners. Right? And as we've done this, we've always put them in the form of a question. You don't have to put them in the form of a question. Sometimes it's kind of helpful to do so, though. And step 4, you want to use each of the weakeners to find an assumption. Right? It's kind of like we're going out of the argument to find the weakeners and then back using those weakeners to go back into the argument to find the assumptions that are already in it. Okay, and this is pretty much it. This is really, when we talk about critical reasoning and critical thinking, anything beyond these 3 steps right here is a detail. This is the fundamental heart of what critical thinking is about. And we'll see that in the lectures to come. Okay, but of course, I'm sure you're wondering right now, okay, yes, that's all good, but how do you actually write the essay? Yeah, I can usually predict what my students are gonna ask even before they ask the questions. And of course, this is a really important question, and we're gonna get to that right now. So writing the essay, this is the final thing that we're gonna talk about today. So structuring your essay. Okay, so your essay, it's going to kind of look like this. Hopefully you can kind of see it the way I've kind of laid it out. It has 3 paragraphs, a shorter paragraph at the beginning, a big paragraph in the middle, and a shorter paragraph at the end. And so this is really a good structure for your essay. But of course, let's get a bit more specific. So the first paragraph right here, right at the top, this is your introduction. And in your introduction, you're going to do a couple things. Number 1, of course, you're going to summarize the argument here. Number 2, you're also going to say that it contains a few weaknesses and assumptions. Now, in that introduction, you're not going to go into the specifics of what specific weaknesses and assumptions it contains. You're just going to say that it does contain problems or weaknesses and assumptions. Okay, we'll get into each of these pieces in more detail in a moment. But the second paragraph here, this is going to be your body paragraph. It's where the most information is. This is the most important part of your essay. And you're going to do a few things. Number 1, you're going to present each assumption. You're going to present the weaknesses and counterexamples. And of course, you're going to be clear and very precise, as we've talked about before. This is where you're going to probably this is the part that you're going to spend the most time writing. And it should be certainly the longest of the 3 paragraphs. Right at the end, this is going to be your conclusion. And your conclusion should be pretty simple, actually. Just basically say that the argument would be better if it addressed each of the assumptions and weaknesses. And your conclusion, it doesn't, sometimes we have memories of writing essays in school, and the conclusion had to be some big general statement, so that the introduction, we don't need any of that here, right? We get straight to the point, and we'll see that in more detail in a moment. But that's the basic overall structure of your essay, the skeleton of your essay, if you will. Okay, so let's get to some of the nuts and bolts. Writing the introduction. Okay, there are a couple things to think about as you write your introduction. Number 1, your introduction should show the reader that you understood the essay topic. A really important part of what the introduction is used for, is just to make sure that you understood what you just read. So in some ways, this is really a reading comprehension exercise. Number two, you want to show the reader that you understand the structure of arguments, right? So you want to show the reader that you know what it means when we say the word conclusion. You know what it means when we say the word assumption, right? That vocabulary is actually quite important. And another thing that you want to think about is just making sure that that even someone who has not read the essay topic itself, even though that's not going to be the person grading it or the people grading it, even that person who hasn't read the essay topic could reasonably understand your essay. You've given enough of an introduction to the topic that they could understand everything else that you're going to say. That's a good way of thinking about it, right? Okay, so let's do it ourselves. Let's write down an introduction to that essay topic that we just saw about restaurants in Spiesa. And so let's do that. Let's do it together to give ourselves an example. Okay, so the author of this travel article believes that the restaurant industry in the country of Spiesa is likely to grow in the coming years. To support this belief, she or he points to several recent social changes, including rising incomes, more free time, more single people, and more interest in gourmet food. This argument, however, is unconvincing because it is based on several unsupported assumptions. Okay, yeah, it's pretty straightforward there. I started by saying what the conclusion of the author was. Afterward, I pointed to the pieces of evidence that the author gave. And then finally, I ended with that very general sentence: this argument is unconvincing because it's based on several unsupported assumptions. And that's a sentence, feel free to use that sentence directly. That's pretty much going to be the guiding sentence of any argument essay that you write. The argument essay is really about the same thing. It's about finding weaknesses and assumptions. So you never want to say something like, this argument is convincing. It's great. I'm totally gonna move to Spiesa, or I'm totally gonna vote for Adams, or I'm totally gonna use Rhodey. You don't want to say that the argument is great, because that defeats the whole purpose of the exercise. Another thing to be slightly careful about here, though, is you don't want to say that the argument is bad, or that it's wrong, or that it's false, or anything like that, because remember that the point here is not to decide whether it's right or wrong. The point is to decide what more information you would need in order to evaluate whether it's right or wrong, right? So if you just come out directly and say it's wrong, well, clearly you've made some major logical leaps in your head already. So just say that it's not great. It has a few problems because there are some unsupported assumptions, and there are possible weaknesses in the argument that would need to be addressed. Something like that. Okay, hopefully that's been fairly clear. Let's move on to the next part, the body. So writing the body. We're going to need a little bit more space for this, so I've made the font a little bit smaller. Okay, a couple things to think about. Number one, you can really start each point by presenting an assumption. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Number two, you can continue each point by presenting the weakness and counterexample associated with each assumption. So in some ways you can kind of say, what you're doing in your essay is you're saying this is an assumption, and you're using the weakness and the counterexample to say this is why it's an assumption. This is why I know it's an assumption in this argument. Okay. And really be sure to explain yourself completely. Everything should be clear. You don't want to leave anything for the reader to figure out by him or herself. Really important. Okay, so let's do this together. We're going to do it, based on the same essay topic as before. So first, the author assumes that the social changes mentioned will continue during the coming years. However, this may not happen. It's possible that a major economic downturn will cause people's incomes to decrease and give them less free time. If this were the case, the restaurant industry would not continue growing as the author believes. Second, by pointing to rising incomes, the author assumes that general costs of living in Spiessa are not rising faster than those incomes. If this were the case, then even though people in the country are making more money, they may not have any extra income to spend at restaurants. And then finally, the author states that more and more people in Spiessa like gourmet food, but he or she never states whether restaurants in the country actually offer gourmet options. The author also never addresses whether single people are more likely to go to restaurants or what people are likely to do with their free time. Okay, so we can get pretty creative with the body of the essay, as you've seen. And the way I've structured it, I was very precise by using sort of structural terms to introduce each of the pieces, like first, second, and then finally. I also, as I said at the top there, I really started with the assumption. So, for example, at the beginning I said the author assumes that the social changes mentioned will continue during the coming years. After that assumption, I really went into the weakness and the counterexample that were associated with it. So it's possible that a major economic downturn will cause people's incomes to decrease and give them less free time. That's a possibility. And I explained specifically why this is a problem. I didn't just leave it up to the reader to figure out by him or herself. I said, if this were the case, the restaurant industry would not continue growing as the author believes. So I really, you might have felt like that was already obvious. Well, nothing is obvious, or pretend that nothing is obvious to the reader. You have to explain everything. It's a good way of going about it. I would also note that kind of at the end, I was a little bit more flexible with myself. Finally, the author states that more and more people in Spiessa like gourmet food, but he or she never states whether restaurants in the country actually offer gourmet options. The author also never addresses whether single people are more likely to go to restaurants or what people are likely to do with their free time. Right? And I know I didn't explain those completely fully. That's okay. At the end, I was just trying to throw in a whole bunch of other options that are kind of relevant here, but that I might not have time to develop fully. And that's okay, just to make sure that you're kind of covering all of your bases. As long as you explain two of them really fully, that's going to be sufficient, right? Okay, so that's your body paragraph, and this is the thing that probably will take the most time to write. But of course, if you've done the analysis, you don't really have to do much thinking as you write it. You're just kind of formulating your sentences, making them clear. Okay, let's move on to the next. So, writing the conclusion, your last paragraph. Okay, the conclusion can be really simple. It can only, you don't need to do anything major here. Just make it 1 or 2 sentences long. Make sure that you address each of the assumptions that you bring up in the body in your conclusion. You'll see what I mean in a second. And basically this is the idea. Your goal here is to help the author out by suggesting what type of information would be necessary to improve the argument. Right? So don't make it too negative. Don't make it, clearly this author did not do a good job in making this argument. No, you're there to be kind of supportive by giving helpful advice to the author. I think that's the best way of looking at it. Kind of be positive in spirit, not negative. Okay. Let's take a look of what we could write here. So to improve this argument, the author should include convincing evidence that the economy is stable and unlikely to collapse in the coming years, more information about how costs of living in the country compare to personal incomes, and how restaurants' offerings correspond to what Spiessan customers are looking for. That's it. That's actually, it's a long sentence. I maybe could have split that up into a couple sentences if I wanted to. But that's all I need for the conclusion. I do not need a big statement that sums everything up, in a general sense about, restaurants and, I don't know, life in general. No, I just need to address each of those assumptions and suggest what type of information would be necessary. And I don't even need to be very specific. Just give us something about the future stability of the economy. That would be really helpful for us to know, or something about, these costs, the cost of living, and how much, buying power people in Spiesa have. Right? That's all that we're looking for here. Okay, and if you've done that, you've done the whole essay. Once you've written that conclusion, you can move on. That's it. Okay, I'd just like to get to a few concluding remarks about all of what we've looked at in this lecture. Just a couple points here, and then we'll be done for the time being. So number one, just remember that the most important part of the essay is the analysis that you present. That's really the most important thing. The beauty of the language, not important at all. This does not need to be a great essay in the sort of literary sense. This is just about your logical analysis, your critical thinking skills. So remember that. To do this analysis, I think it's a good idea to spend the first 8 to 10 minutes just reading the argument and finding some weaknesses and assumptions. Really, if you do the analysis first and write the writing later, it's actually a lot easier, because you don't have to think as much. And believe me, as somebody who's graded a lot of essays in my time, it's very clear when somebody was kind of doing the analysis and writing at the same time, and it leads to a much more convoluted, frankly, a much more difficult to read and unclear essay than an essay where somebody had done the thinking before starting to put pen to paper. Okay, next point. Don't worry about minor mistakes in your English writing. The only time grammatical mistakes are a problem is when they get in the way of the reader's understanding. Yeah, so this is a big point. If English is not your first language, that's really not a problem here. This is not an English language test. This is about how clearly you present your ideas. And of course, being somewhat good at writing in English, or able to write in English, proficient, is certainly important, but being perfect in your English is not important at all. Just make sure that your sentences are not so bad that they get in the way of somebody's ability to understand them. And to do that, try to write really short sentences. We don't need to be beautiful in our writing here. Just keep it short. The only other grammatical issue I might state here, but I'm not even going to put it on the as a point, is that if you basically are constantly making the same grammatical error time and time again, that's a problem. So, that's not usually the case, but you could think about that a little bit. So if you're not writing the wrong tense of the verb every single time, or you're not according the verb with its subject, something really, really bad like that would also be a problem. But most minor mistakes are not a problem at all. So spend about 20 minutes writing the essay, but of course leave 1 or 2 minutes at the end to correct it. Very important. And just remember to explain yourself fully. Don't leave it up to the reader to make the logical connections in her or his mind. That's definitely important. And this means that it might feel like you're being very obvious, being very, almost like, it might feel like school writing, and that's good, actually. That is what you should be aiming for. It's never too obvious to state clearly. Along those same lines, don't really worry too much about repetition or repeating yourself. Don't repeat concepts, of course, but if you're repeating the same kind of phrase structure or even the same words, that's not a problem. That's more stylistic. It's about your writing style and the beauty of your phrases, and that's not what we're dealing with here. That's not what we're concerned with. So, of course, if you find another way to say it, that's great, wonderful, do it. But if not, there's no problem. Okay. And then, of course, if you do everything right here, this is a creative exercise. We don't have to, find the right answer. There are many right answers, and that's great. If you do everything right in terms of analysis and structuring and writing, you'll do well on the essay. It's as simple as that. It's one of the easiest grades that you can get. And another thing that's really important is that if you practice this well, you'll also be very prepared for the reasoning questions in the test, or in the rest of the test later on. So it's really, really a good idea to practice this and to make sure that you are doing everything correctly and that you're really comfortable with it, because there's no reason not to get a really good mark on the essay. All right, well, that's all for right now, and I thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next lecture.